Hey, I'm Doug. Welcome to Backcountry Pilgrim. This channel is all about hiking, camping, and backpacking. And this is the third in my How to Get Started Backpacking series. This time we are going to look at our shelter. Your backpacking shelter is basically what is going to keep you sheltered from the elements while you are in camp, and especially while you are asleep. In my last video, I described how I would choose a sweet backpack, and we're going to look at a sweet shelter setup this time. The first thing you need to decide when you are picking out a shelter is what sort of shelter you are looking for. There are actually a number of different options out there, more than you might suspect, especially if you're just getting started. But I'm going to narrow them down to basically two different kinds, and I'm going to very quickly narrow it down to just one of those for you. The most basic difference between just about every kind of shelter is essentially where it goes. Is it going to be hanging between two trees or on the ground? If you're going to be on the ground, there are a number of options, from something as minimalistic as a bivvy, which is essentially a water and bug resistant sack that you slide your sleeping bag into and then zip up. You can go up from there to a tarp, which gives you a bit more space but actually has less protection, because a tarp alone is kind of like a tent without a floor or doors. Up from that you have the classic tent, and that is what we're going to be talking about today. Now, hammock camping can be pretty great, and there are pluses and minuses to it, just like there are pluses and minuses to tent camping. In my opinion, for a beginner, the pluses and minuses favor tent camping over hammock camping. But before the hammock police come out in the comments, let me briefly go over some of the differences between hammock and tent camping so that you can make a good decision. If you decide as a beginner that you want to go the hammock route, there are plenty of good videos out there. I will recommend some in the description below. But after a brief discussion of hammocks versus tents, we're going to move on to tent camping. Now, if you're new to backpacking and you've never seen a hammock camp setup before, you might be thinking that it's just a standard sheet hung between two trees that you sleep on. The kind of thing you might find on someone's porch or backyard. And if that is what you're picturing, you might think that hammock camping sounds pretty simple. It sounds like it's probably going to be pretty inexpensive, and it's probably going to be pretty lightweight. And those three things are typically going to make a backpacking experience a lot better. However, hammock camping is very different than just lying down in a hammock. Hammock camping, just like tent camping, is a system. It's made of multiple parts, probably about a half dozen or so, depending on the exact style. And when you put all those parts together, the weight increases. And in fact, depending on what you get, it's actually harder to get a hammock setup down into the ultralight range than it is to get a tent down there. Now, we're not going to be going into those kind of ultralight options in this video because, again, that's something that's a little bit more advanced. But the cost is not going to be that much different either. I saw a great video that I will link to below from Outdoor Vitals where he goes through two comparable setups. And in that video, he points out that not only is the weight fairly comparable, but the cost is fairly comparable. A comparable hammock and tent setup going to come in around the $500 range. Now, keep in mind that we're talking about camping. We're not just talking about a single piece of gear. So we have to include the sleep system in the hammock or tent system, because that is an integral part of the choice you're making, and so that has to be accounted for in the weight and cost category. And finally, when it comes to simplicity, you're still looking at least half a dozen components to setting up a good hammock or a good tent. Now, often tents are going to have closer to 8 pieces, but they can get down to about 6 depending on the kind of tent you get. So once again, you're really kind of right in there with the hammock setup. So hammocks are not really lighter, they're not cheaper, and they're not simpler than tents. Another important consideration between hammocks and tents is how universal they're going to be as far as being able to be used in the backcountry. Although it would be difficult to put a quantitative number on this, There are a number of situations where hammocks are not going to work, and there are a number of situations where tents are not going to work. This becomes one of my biggest arguments for starting with a tent, because ultimately if you're going to be a backpacker, you're probably going to need a tent even if you switch to hammock camping. There are going to be some situations where you're going to need that tent anyway, whereas there's probably never going to be a situation where you need a hammock if you only have a tent. So the first big consideration with a hammock is that you've got to have trees to set it up. Now, if you've got that, you're in great shape. And the beautiful thing with a hammock is that it doesn't matter what the ground cover is like. It doesn't matter if it's uneven. It doesn't matter if it's too rocky. It doesn't matter if there's snow. Once you get your hammock hung up, you are going to have the exact same experience that you do any other time, regardless of what's on the ground. The problem, of course, is what happens if you don't have trees. If you're out in a desert type area, or you're in the mountains and above the tree line, a hammock system is going to be a complete failure. And you can't just have trees, you have to have the right size trees so that your straps fit around them. The trees can't be too close, they can't be too far. Now when it comes to tents, sure, they are a bit more universal when it comes to where you can set them up, especially certain kinds of tents, which we'll talk about in a minute. But if you are on uneven ground, rocky ground, snowy ground,
with liquid hot magma,
tent setup can be a little bit more difficult than it is just going out in your backyard and putting that thing up. People who adopt hammock camping typically do so because they say they got the best night's sleep they've ever got in the backcountry, and they are willing to give up all the other things that a tent brings in order to get that comfort. Obviously, this is a subjective choice, and it's something you're going to kind of have to figure out for yourself. Some other things that are nice about hammocks is that you don't really run into the condensation problem that you do with certain kinds of tents. We'll talk about that in a minute. And further, hammock camping is just a lot cleaner when it comes to the actual camp setup. You're not putting your stuff on the ground, so you don't need to worry about mud, rain, snow melting,
liquid hot magma,
or anything else, because you're literally suspended in the air in your campsite. Also, it's a lot easier to set up a hammock system in the rain because you can begin with your rain protection and then set everything else up underneath it. And that goes for taking it down as well. And what that means is that a hammock setup can stay a lot cleaner to go in and out of your backpack than it usually can with a tent. Now, what are the downsides to a hammock? Well, number one, it takes quite a bit more of a skilled setup than a typical tent does. You're going to need to do some practice, you're going to make some mistakes, and you've really got to tweak that system down before it becomes the luxury that you hear about. Despite some of the frustration that can come with trying to set up a tent that you haven't set up before, most people eventually can get it figured out because they really only have one correct way to be set up. It's either set up correctly or it's not set up at all, and it is usually fairly straightforward. Hammock camping is also not going to do as well in extreme conditions. Now, as a beginner, you may not be facing those, but you do need to be ready for them. Mountain weather can change quickly, and there are certain situations where a hammock setup is not going to do you very well compared to a typical tent setup. There's also just the experience of being in the hammock. It is a lot more confined space. You don't really have room to move around. You also might feel more exposed in a hammock, even though technically most of what goes into giving you that feeling of security in a tent is kind of a false security. The exposure that you have in a hammock can be great for the views, but some people may not be comfortable with feeling quite that close to nature. Tents are also more private. You have some room to change your clothes. You can get away from other people if you need to for a while. And it gives you a place to keep your gear so that all of your stuff is with you. It's not sitting outside on the ground. And finally, the fact that you can get more than one person in the tent can be really great when it comes to couple situations, family situations, where you don't necessarily want to have to find an entire camp area for every single person in the backpacking party. Now, the hammock versus tent discussion is not a point system. You can't just make a two-column chart and whichever one has the most pluses in which column wins. Every single one of these is something that could be important to you. Any one of them could be a deal killer for you. For each individual person, they have to make a decision about whether they're going to use tents or hammocks. My suggestion would be to go ahead and try out both. However, I do think that the items in the plus column for tents favor beginners more than those in the hammock side. At the end of the day, I think that most backpackers really need to have both. And even if you go to 100% hammock camping, nothing wrong with having a tent that you can borrow out for someone that's coming with you. You're going to have a tent anyway. If you're a beginner, I would recommend starting there. Okay, so moving on to the next S in finding a sweet shelter. Much like backpacks, the next thing you really need to consider is its size. Tents are typically rated size-wise by how many people they can fit. And so you'll hear things like a 2-person tent or a 3-person tent. And often that number will be incorporated into the name of the tent. So for example, my main backpacking tent is the Lanshan 2. What makes it a 2 is not because it's the second iteration of the Lanshan series, but because it is a 2-person tent. Now, the first thing you will learn when considering tent sizes is that calling a tent a 2 or a 3-person tent can be considered something of a misnomer. When most tents are rated for a certain number of people, what they mean is not how many people can comfortably fit in the tent, but how many people could sleep in the tent with their own sleeping pad. Now, we'll get into sleeping pads in the next video when we talk about sleep systems, but when we're considering tent camping, we have to consider some parts of the sleep system because they're kind of integral to the whole thing. Now, sleeping pads are often less than 2 feet wide, so that means that a tent that is only 4 feet wide could be considered a 2-person tent. That doesn't mean that they can fit comfortably. It doesn't mean they're going to get in there with their gear. It doesn't mean you can both sit up. It just means that 2 people can get their sleeping pads in there and lie down. So I would recommend that you kind of mentally upsize your tent by 1 person if you want the more comfortable, somewhat spacious camping experience in a tent. You're not going to get it if it matches the number of people in it. Now, ultimately, you're going to have a look at it, or at least be really good at picturing measurements, because the actual footprint of the tent, the angles chosen to cut the material, the peak height, the width, the length, vestibules, number of doors. There are so many variations on tents, and a lot of these do affect the overall size experience, and it's, for me at least, really difficult to figure that out without actually having the tent right there in front of me. So ultimately, I'm going to recommend that if you can, get out to an outfitter where the tents are set up so that you can get a very good idea of what this is going to be like. Now, as with backpacks, the tent size also includes the weight considerations. Tents vary widely in how heavy they are. The different materials that are used, the different kinds of tents that there are, all of this is going to have a pretty radical effect on the overall weight. Tent size also includes its pack size or pack weight. In other words, once you get that tent down and broken down and in your backpack, how much room is it going to take up in there? How much does it actually weigh? Are there parts you can get rid of? These things are usually included in the description of the tent. Now, another metric that you might see on the manufacturer website is the difference between a tent's minimal trail weight and kind of maximum package weight. The package weight is literally everything that the manufacturer gives you with your tent. That includes probably some kind of stuff sack, the instructions, absolutely everything. Minimum trail weight is a bit different. This includes the tent itself, the rainfly if it has one, and the poles. And the reason that is given is that it is kind of the best set of weight measurements for comparison with other tents. There are still more things that you're going to need to set it up probably, but because those things can vary so much, they're not as useful in comparing tent to tent. Typically speaking, as the weight goes down, so does everything else that you want with the tent. It's going to be less durable, it's going to be less weather resistant, it's going to have fewer features, it's going to be smaller. So everything that you might want in a tent is probably going to increase with weight or decrease with weight. Alright, so once you have decided what size tent you want, the next S has to do with season. Tents are typically divided into 2 different kinds of season: a 3-season tent or a 4-season tent. A 3-season tent is one that is set up to keep you sheltered in every season of the year except winter. A 4-season tent is one that should work as well in winter. Now, it may surprise you to know that the difference between a 3 and a 4 season tent really doesn't have very much to do with its warmth. In most cases, the warmth of the tent is not even really part of the consideration because you're going to be getting your warmth from your sleep system, not so much from your tent. Rather, the most important difference between a 3 and 4 season tent is how strong it is. In winter, there's a good chance that snow is going to get dumped on the tent. There's a good chance that very strong winds are going to buffet it around, and those kinds of things are typically more of an issue in winter than they are the other 3 seasons. So 3 season tents are usually going to be lighter. They're not going to have as many structural supports. There's going to be a lot more mesh, and all of these things are great as long as the tent can function in the environment that you're going to be in. A 4 season tent is going to use heavier materials, more support structures, less mesh. There's just going to be a more robust shelter there that is going to be able to take more of a pounding. Next, you're going to want to look at the structure or the setup of the tent. They both start with S, take your pick. And the biggest difference here is going to be between a tent that is freestanding versus one that is non-freestanding. And there are some that are also in between called semi-freestanding. A freestanding tent is one that does not require any tie-outs for its structural stability. And a tie-out is basically a piece of cordage that goes out to a tent stake or a tree or a rock or something that is needed to keep the tent in the shape it's supposed to be. A freestanding tent does not need these. Once the tent is set up, you can literally pick it up off the ground and walk around with it. It is completely self-contained and is not reliant on any other features to work. A non-freestanding tent is one that is going to require that you are able to set up those guy lines, drive tent stakes into the ground, or tie off to trees or rocks or something, because the walls are actually being held in place by the ropes or cords rather than by some kind of internal structure. Now, the good news with a freestanding tent is that you can set it up pretty much anywhere you want to because you aren't relying on your ability to get stakes into the ground. So as you can imagine, on really hard ground or really loose ground or someone's deck, a freestanding tent is definitely the way to go because you don't want to be having to pound stakes in for the tent to work. The downside to the freestanding tent is that it's typically going to weigh a lot more because it is reliant on a pole system to keep it in place, whereas a non-freestanding tent just needs a few stakes and that cordage. Semi-freestanding means that there's some part of the tent that isn't going to work without tie-downs, but the main body can be held together just by its poles. The second big consideration when it comes to the shelter structure or setup is whether it is a single or a double wall tent. A single wall tent basically means that the material that the main tent is made of is the only part of the tent that you are going to set up. A double wall tent starts with the main tent body, but then also has a second layer of material, usually called a rain fly, that goes over the outside. Now, there are a number of cool things about double wall tents. When you are inside your tent, your breathing actually changes the humidity level inside the tent that you're in. After a night of breathing, you've got condensation all over the inside of your tent, and you do not want all of that water falling down onto your gear or your sleeping bag or your face. This can actually be a pretty serious problem. So to mitigate that, they created the double wall tent. And what that does is it gives you kind of a light mesh tent that allows the vapor to go through it. And then when it hits the double wall, the second wall, the condensation sticks to it and hopefully runs down the side, keeping the interior tent nice and dry. Some of them can actually be set up like a hammock, where you begin with the rain fly, and then you can actually get in under the rain fly and set the tent up protected from the rain. Another thing that I like about double wall tents is that you don't always need the rain fly. Several times I have camped out in the backcountry and just left the rain fly out on the ground. If it's been warm enough, I like to just lay there and I can see the stars and I can see what's around me. Now, that's not an option with a single wall tent, because in a single wall tent, the wall of the tent kind of is the rain fly, and you can't really do without it. Now, of course, because it's more material, a double wall tent is going to be heavier than a single wall tent. So again, so much of this comes back to weight considerations. Now, the final S in this sweet shelter system has to do with the tent style. And this is basically like my catch-all category for everything else to consider about a tent. And this is where personal taste becomes very important, because now we're talking about things like the number of doors. For example, if you're carrying around a 3-person tent so that you can get 2 people comfortably in the tent, do you want them having to crawl over you to get in and out of the tent? If not, you're going to want them to have their own door. Tents also often come with things called vestibules, which is an extra section of tent, usually that comes off the rain fly, that allows you to have some limited protection outside the tent proper. And these are great for storing like muddy boots or your backpack if it's not going to fit in the tent. Technically your stuff is still out on the ground, but it at least has kind of a tarp section over it so that you're still somewhat enclosed, you're still somewhat protected from the weather, but you're not taking up real estate inside the actual tent. A vestibule is often a good place to do your cooking. So in the morning when you get up, you can just kind of sit up, unzip one door of the tent, and start your cooking under the relative protection of the vestibule without trying to cook inside the tent, which would not be a good idea at all. You should look at the tent's color. You know, what color do you want all of your stuff to be in the morning when the sun lights that thing up like a light bulb? Do you want a raised bathtub style floor, which will help keep water out if it happens to flood in the middle of the night? How many features do you want in the tent? Do you want clips to hang lights off of? Do you want pockets for storage? On and on it goes. Now, those things are all really just personal taste. Last, I want to talk about 3 upgrades that you should make sure you have regardless of what kind of tent you decide on. The first one is seam sealing. Seam sealing is a distinct process from the making of the tent where the material comes together in a seam, is actually coated with some kind of covering that makes it waterproof. Even if the tent material is waterproof or water resistant, it is not going to be at the seams, and if you end up in a heavy rain, you could basically end up with walls of water dripping down into your tent as it comes through those seams. And so it's important to seam seal those either by yourself or getting a tent that already has seam sealing, or else the waterproof nature of the tent is going to be seriously compromised. Another thing you really need to do is make sure that you have a good ground cloth or footprint, a heavier duty material than what the tent is made of that fits directly under your tent and keeps the tent itself separated from the ground, which is going to give the tent some longevity that it's not going to have if you just keep setting it up on the ground itself. You got to keep in mind that dirt is basically little teeny tiny rocks, and if you're walking around in your tent, rolling around in your tent, you're grinding that material into that grit, and it's going to destroy the integrity of the tent much earlier than it should. The reason you can't just throw a big tarp down for a footprint is that it's going to stick out from the tent, and as the tent pushes down into the tarp with your weight, it's going to create kind of a bowl that is going to actually collect rainwater or little rills that come down through the mud and deliver them straight into the tent and soak you out. And the last upgrade that I would suggest is changing out your tent stakes. Yes, believe it or not, there are different styles of tent stakes also. And these are actually fairly important because if you have a tent that is in any way reliant on staking out guy lines for its function, you need to have them work. Now, there are a number of different kinds. You might have seen those plastic, big, thick, like railroad spike stakes for some tents. Yeah, go ahead and throw those away. What most manufacturers are going to give you is a fairly cheap, fairly small aluminum tent stake. And these are going to be fine as long as you are not in a very challenging area. Some tent stakes are called shepherd hooks, and those are basically what they sound like. They look like little hooks on top. And they're kind of nice because they're light and they're easy to take in and out of the ground, but that also means that they don't work super well in challenging situations. They don't develop very much friction inside the ground, and so they can pull out too easily. A level up from the shepherd hook is the peg or the tent nail, which is basically like a more robust straight spike. Those are going to do a lot better if you're trying to drive through very hard ground, but they also have the friction problem, so they don't necessarily stay that well in every situation. What I typically see is more of a V-shaped tent stake, where if you look down the length of it, you'd see the letter V. These are very lightweight, and they increase friction with the ground by increasing the surface area of the stake without also dramatically increasing how heavy it is. These are nice for storage because they can kind of nest into each other, and they are fairly strong given their shape, and these do pretty well in most conditions as long as the dirt isn't very loose. At kind of the top level is the Y-shaped tent stake, and it essentially takes all of the advantages of the V-shaped stake but adds another panel, increasing its friction and increasing its strength without dramatically increasing its weight. These give you maximal strength and maximal friction in a tent stake that is still fairly lightweight. I will put links to all of these below so that you can kind of check out what you might be interested in getting. I will also post links to some of the more popular tents out there, and I would love to hear in the comments what you use and why you chose it. To both simplify and sum all of this up, this is what I would recommend to a beginning backpacker. I would recommend a tent. A 2-person tent, and a 3-season tent, a double wall tent, a freestanding tent. Make sure that you seam seal it, go get yourself a footprint, and go upgrade your tent stakes. What you will end up with is a tent that you will be able to use over and over again, even if you migrate over to the hammock side of things, even if you start doing hardcore winter backpacking, you're always going to have use for a tent like that, so you might as well just grab one to begin with. It's the most universal, it's the easiest to find, it's one of the least expensive types, and you shouldn't have much trouble getting all the additional features that you want. Alright, I hope this video has helped you out or has helped you learn how to explain shelter systems to someone who is a beginner. If it has, would you mind giving the video a like? And I hope that you are subscribed to the channel. If you are, also make sure that you click that bell notification, because if you don't, YouTube isn't going to tell you when new videos come out. Until next time, I'm Doug. This is Backcountry Pilgrim. Thank you so much for watching. Catch you next time.